Margaret adjusted the collar of her beige cardigan as she stepped into Morrison's grocery, the same store she had visited every Thursday morning for nearly 2 decades. It was one of those small, locally owned supermarkets where cashiers knew your name and customers still exchanged pleasantries in the aisles. She liked the predictability of it, the sense of routine. At 72, predictability was a comfort. But today, something felt different. The moment she entered, Margaret noticed him. A man in his late 40s stood near the fresh produce section, gripping a grocery basket with white-knuckled intensity. He wasn't dressed like the typical customers she saw. A faded gray hoodie covered his frame, and his jeans were dirt-streaked, as if he had been sleeping outside. His beard was patchy, uneven, the kind that hinted at months of neglect rather than a stylistic choice. But it was his eyes that unsettled her. There was something haunted about them. They darted across the store, wary, almost as if he expected someone to pounce on him at any moment. Margaret lingered near the canned goods, pretending to compare brands of soup while discreetly observing him. He moved with hesitancy, picking up a loaf of bread before placing it back. He repeated the action with a carton of milk, then a small bag of rice. It was as though he were calculating, measuring, debating. Then, as if summoning his courage, he strode toward the checkout line. Margaret found herself drawn to the scene unfolding before her. The cashier, a young girl named Amber, barely out of high school, greeted him with a polite but wary smile. The man placed his few items on the conveyor belt: a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, 2 apples, and a pack of instant noodles. "That'll be $11.49, Amber said. The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a few crumpled dollar bills and a handful of coins. He placed them on the counter and quickly began counting, his fingers trembling. Margaret could feel the tension building. The line behind him grew impatient. A middle-aged woman in a navy blazer sighed loudly, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. The man's breathing quickened. He recounted his money twice, 3 times. Then, with a quiet, almost defeated sigh, he closed his eyes for a brief moment before whispering, "I don't have enough." Amber hesitated, glancing at the growing line of customers. "Would you like to remove something?" she asked gently. The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked down at his groceries like a man forced to choose which limb to sacrifice. Margaret had seen enough. Without a second thought, she stepped forward and placed a crisp $20 bill on the counter. "I've got it," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. The man's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto hers. For the first time, she saw something other than wariness in them, shock, then something deeper. "You don't have to do that," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "I know," Margaret replied with a small smile. "But I want to." For a moment, he didn't move. Then, with a slow, almost reluctant nod, he exhaled. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with something Margaret couldn't quite place. Amber took the bill, handed him his change, and bagged his groceries. The man took the plastic bag, his fingers tightening around the handle as though anchoring himself to reality. Margaret expected him to leave then. Most people would. They would nod their thanks and disappear into the world, grateful but eager to escape the discomfort of their vulnerability being exposed. But he didn't. Instead, he lingered, staring at her as if trying to memorize her face. "You're very kind," he said at last. Margaret chuckled, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't make a fuss about it. Just pay it forward when you can." Something flickered across his face, pain, guilt, or maybe something else entirely. He gave her one last lingering look before turning and walking out the door. Margaret thought that was the end of it. Just another act of kindness in her long life, nothing more. But as she gathered her own groceries and approached the register, Amber hesitated before scanning her items. "You shouldn't have done that," she said quietly. Margaret frowned. "Pardon?" Amber leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. That guy. Daniel. Well, people talk. They say he's dangerous. Margaret's stomach tightened. Dangerous how? Amber glanced toward the door, as if expecting him to reappear. I don't know exactly. He just showed up in town a few weeks ago. Keeps to himself. Some say he's on the run. Margaret's fingers stiffened around her purse strap. On the run? She shook off the thought. People love to gossip, especially in small towns like theirs. She had spent her whole life ignoring baseless rumors, and she wasn't about to start believing them now. Still, as she stepped out into the cool autumn air, a strange unease settled in her chest. She pushed the feeling aside and walked home, enjoying the crisp crunch of leaves beneath her shoes. Her house was only a few blocks from the store, a cozy little place she had shared with her late husband for 40 years before his passing. She had grown accustomed to the solitude, embracing the peace it brought. But that night, as she prepared a cup of tea, she couldn't shake the lingering sense that something wasn't right. A soft rustling outside made her pause. She moved to the window and peered through the curtains. Her breath hitched. Parked across the street, partially hidden in the shadows, was a black sedan she had never seen before. The driver's seat was occupied, though she couldn't make out a face. Her heart pounded. Probably just a neighbor's guest, she told herself. But then, as if sensing her gaze, the car's engine roared to life, and it pulled away, vanishing into the night. Margaret's hands trembled as she set down her tea. She had lived in this town for over 50 years. She knew its people, its rhythm, its quiet predictability. But now, for the first time in decades, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A creeping, unsettling feeling that she was being watched. And somehow, she knew, this all started with the man she had helped at the store. Margaret barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, flashes of Daniel's haunted expression reappeared in her mind. The way he hesitated before accepting her kindness, the pain in his voice when he whispered his thanks. And then there was the car. That black sedan, parked outside her home like an omen. It was gone now, but the feeling it left behind lingered like an unshakable chill. She sat in her kitchen before dawn, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, staring at the window as if expecting to see the car again. But there was nothing. Just the quiet hum of the town waking up, cars rolling down the road, distant voices, the occasional bark of a dog. Normalcy. That's what she needed to focus on. Determined to shake the unease from her chest, Margaret decided to visit the community center. Every Saturday, she volunteered at the food pantry, organizing donations and helping distribute meals to families in need. It was one of the few places where she felt truly useful, where her presence mattered. The center was already bustling when she arrived. Volunteers stacked boxes of canned goods, children clung to their mothers' hands, and the air buzzed with the low murmur of conversation. Margaret fell into her usual routine, sorting through bags of groceries, chatting with old friends, and making sure every family left with enough to get them through the week. She was in the middle of handing a bag of rice to a young mother when she saw him. Daniel stood near the entrance, his shoulders hunched, hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets. He wasn't looking at her, but she knew he was aware of her presence. His posture was too rigid, too uneasy. Margaret felt her breath hitch. She had convinced herself she wouldn't see him again, that their brief interaction at the grocery store was a one-time thing. And yet, here he was. She forced herself to remain calm, focusing on the task in front of her. Maybe he was just here for food, like so many others. Maybe she had overreacted. But then, as if sensing her gaze, Daniel's eyes met hers. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, he turned and walked out the door. Margaret hesitated only a moment before setting down the bag in her hands and following him. Outside, the air was crisp, tinged with the scent of autumn leaves and distant chimney smoke. She found Daniel a few yards away, standing near the side of the building, hands still buried in his pockets. "You ran off awfully fast," she said, keeping her voice light. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I shouldn't be here." Margaret crossed her arms. "Why not?" He hesitated, glancing around, as if searching for something, or someone. "Look, I wanted to say thank you again. For what you did at the store." She studied him carefully. "It was just groceries, dear. Nothing life-changing." Daniel let out a dry, humorless laugh. "For you, maybe." Something in his tone made Margaret pause. "What's going on, Daniel?" she asked softly. "You're jumpy. You look over your shoulder like someone's chasing you." For a second, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he rubbed a hand down his face and muttered, "Because someone is." A cold shiver ran down Margaret's spine. She swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Daniel glanced down the street before turning back to her. His eyes, filled with exhaustion and something darker, locked onto hers. "I used to work for some bad people," he admitted quietly. "Did some things I'm not proud of. I got out. At least, I thought I did. But they don't let people just walk away." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "Are you saying that black car you saw last night?" he cut in. "It wasn't a coincidence." Her stomach turned to ice. Daniel exhaled, pressing his fingers to his temples. "I don't know how they found me. I've been off the grid for months. But they know I'm here now." Margaret took a slow, measured breath, trying to steady herself. "And what do they want?" He let out a bitter laugh. "To make sure I don't talk." Margaret didn't realize she was gripping the fabric of her sweater until she felt her nails pressing against her palms. "You mean they'll kill me, Margaret," Daniel said bluntly. "It's only a matter of time." The weight of his words settled heavily between them. Margaret felt the logical part of her mind screaming at her to walk away, to go home and pretend she never got involved. This wasn't her fight. This wasn't her burden to carry. But she also knew she couldn't do that. Daniel was a man in trouble, a man trying to escape his past. And despite everything, despite the fear coiling in her gut, Margaret couldn't bring herself to turn her back on him. She straightened her shoulders. "Come with me." Daniel blinked. "What?" "You need a place to lay low," she said. "I have a guest room. You'll be safe there." He shook his head furiously. "No. No way. If they find me at your house, you'll be in danger too." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'm old, Daniel. I've lived a full life. If something happens to me, well, at least I'll go knowing I did the right thing." He stared at her in stunned silence. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. Margaret didn't know it at the time, but this decision, this sin Margaret drove home in silence, her hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. Daniel sat beside her, his posture stiff, his eyes darting to the side mirrors every few seconds. Every car they passed, every streetlight they stopped at, she could feel his tension growing. She had never been the type to get tangled up in other people's messes. But something about Daniel, about the haunted way he carried himself, made it impossible to turn away. He was running from something dangerous, and now, by offering him a place to stay, she was tangled up in it too. As they pulled into her driveway, Margaret cast a quick glance down the street. The black sedan wasn't there, but that didn't mean much. If what Daniel had said was true, these people were professionals. They wouldn't just sit outside her house with their headlights on. They would watch from the shadows, waiting. Margaret tried not to let the thought settle too deeply in her mind. Once inside, she locked the door and turned to Daniel. "I'll set up the guest room for you. It's nothing fancy, but the bed's comfortable." Daniel stood awkwardly in the hallway, his gaze flicking to the windows as if expecting someone to come crashing through them. You really don't have to do this. Margaret exhaled sharply. You think I don't know that? I could have walked away at the store. I could have walked away again at the food pantry. But I didn't. And I won't. So stop arguing. Daniel hesitated, then gave a small nod. All right. Margaret led him down the hall to the guest room. It was a modest space, with a neatly made bed, a wooden dresser, and a small reading lamp. She set a clean towel on the bed and turned to him. You can shower if you need to. Bathroom's just down the hall. You can shower if you need to. Bathroom's just down the hall. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Thank you. Margaret studied him for a moment. Are you hungry? He hesitated, then nodded. Margaret made her way to the kitchen, pulling out leftovers from the fridge. She heated up a plate of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes, setting it on the table with a glass of water. Daniel sat down hesitantly, his movements slow and careful, as if he wasn't sure this was real. She sat across from him, watching as he took the first bite. He ate quickly but not sloppily, like someone who had learned to ration their food, someone who wasn't used to having meals come easily. Margaret sipped her tea. You want to tell me how you got into this mess? Daniel wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and set down his fork. He leaned back slightly, his eyes distant. I wasn't always like this, he said after a moment. I had a normal life once. A job. A family. Margaret stayed quiet, letting him continue at his own pace. I used to work in finance, he said. Good money, long hours. I met the wrong people, people who offered shortcuts. More money, less work. It started small. Just looking the other way on a few things. Signing papers without asking questions. He exhaled. Then it escalated. Money laundering, fraud, covering tracks for people I shouldn't have even been in the same room with. Margaret felt a chill creep up her spine. And you got out? Daniel let out a bitter laugh. Tried to. You don't just get out of something like this. When I realized how deep I was in, I cut ties, disappeared. Changed my name, burned everything that connected me to my past. He shook his head. I thought I was safe. But they found me. Margaret leaned forward, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. And now they want you dead? Daniel nodded. I know too much. And if they think I might talk, his voice trailed off. Margaret exhaled slowly. And that black car? Not the first time I've seen it, he admitted. I noticed it a few weeks ago, but I wasn't sure. Then last night. I knew. Margaret tapped her fingers against the table. What do we do now? Daniel blinked. We? She gave him a look. You think I'm just going to send you off now? They're watching you. And if they saw you come here, that means they're watching me too. So, like it or not, I'm involved. Daniel looked down at his hands. I never wanted to drag you into this. Margaret scoffed. Too late for that, dear. He let out a small chuckle, the first real sign of humor she'd seen from him. But it faded quickly. If they know I'm here, they'll come eventually. Margaret nodded. Then we'll be ready. Daniel gave her a wary look. Margaret, I don't think you understand who these people are. She tilted her head slightly. You ever met my late husband? Daniel frowned. No. Margaret smirked. He was a detective. Spent decades putting criminals behind bars. Taught me a few things about being prepared. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You're telling me an elderly woman is going to outsmart professional criminals? Margaret's smirk widened. You'd be surprised what an old lady can do when she's determined. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. This is insane. Maybe, Margaret admitted. But it's our best shot. For the first time since they met, she saw something shift in Daniel's expression. It wasn't just gratitude or desperation. It was something deeper, trust. Margaret stood up and grabbed a notepad from the counter. First things first. We secure the house. Change the locks, reinforce the doors. I'll call an old friend about setting up security cameras. Daniel watched her with something close to disbelief. You really have a plan for this? Margaret shot him a pointed look. I've survived 72 years on this earth, dear. You don't get to my age without learning how to handle trouble. Daniel shook his head with a small smile. I think I might actually believe you. Margaret winked. Good. Because this is just the beginning. As she started making preparations, she didn't know what the next few days would bring. She didn't know that by the time this was all over, she would be facing something far darker than she ever imagined. But one thing was certain, whatever came next, she and Daniel would face it together. The night settled over Margaret's house like a thick, uneasy blanket. The air was still, too still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside, Daniel sat in the dimly lit living room, his fingers twitching against the fabric of the couch. Margaret was in the kitchen, methodically making tea, as if it were just another evening, another normal, quiet night. But they both knew better. The locks had been changed, the security cameras installed. Margaret had even rigged a simple alarm system using her late husband's old police tricks, a subtle, nearly invisible thread across the main entry points. If anyone tried to sneak in, they'd know. It wasn't much, but it was something. Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind racing. He had been on the run for so long that he had almost forgotten what it was like to sit in one place, to not feel like a hunted animal. But the momentary peace wasn't real. It was just a pause, a fleeting moment before the storm crashed down. Margaret set a steaming cup of tea in front of him and took a seat across the room. You keep looking at the windows like someone's already inside. Daniel gave a weak chuckle. That's how it feels. Margaret sipped her tea. They won't come tonight. He looked at her sharply. How do you know that? She smirked. Because they're watching. People like that don't rush in. They study, they wait, they learn your habits. And they expect fear to do half their work for them. Daniel swallowed hard. That's supposed to make me feel better? Margaret shrugged. It should. Fear is predictable. If you know how they think, you can stay a step ahead. Daniel ran a hand down his face. So what's the next step? Margaret leaned forward, lowering her voice. We turn the tables. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? She set her cup down with a soft clink. We make them uncomfortable. Make them second-guess themselves. Right now, they think they have the upper hand. They think you're scared, helpless. We need to change that. Daniel let out a dry laugh. And how exactly do we do that? Margaret smiled, a slow, knowing smile. I have a few ideas. The next morning, before the sun even fully rose, Margaret was already making calls. Not to the police, no, she knew better than that. Daniel had said these people had influence, and calling the cops would only tip them off. Instead, she reached out to people who owed her favors. A retired detective friend. A journalist who specialized in exposing corruption. A tech-savvy neighbor who knew how to dig into things most people didn't want found. By midday, she had a list of names, companies, and financial transactions linked to Daniel's past employers. She wasn't naive enough to think she could take them down with a few phone calls, but information was power. And she had just armed herself with enough to make someone very nervous. Daniel watched in stunned silence as Margaret worked, her hands moving with practiced ease over papers and notes. "I thought you were just some kind old woman who helped people with groceries." Margaret didn't look up. "I've lived a long time, Daniel. Long enough to know that sometimes, kindness alone doesn't cut it." He leaned back, shaking his head. "I can't believe you're doing all this for me." Margaret finally met his eyes. "You're not the first person I've helped, and you won't be the last. But I will say this, you might be the most dangerous." Daniel let out a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "That's not exactly comforting." Margaret stood, smoothing out her sweater. "Come on. We're going for a drive." Daniel hesitated. "Is that a good idea?" Margaret arched an eyebrow. "Are you planning to hide in this house forever?" Reluctantly, he followed her to the car. They drove through town, passing streets that felt eerily normal. People walked their dogs, kids rode their bikes, and life went on as if nothing was wrong. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Margaret parked at a small diner on the outskirts of town. It was old, the kind of place that smelled like coffee in Greece, with faded red booths and a jukebox that barely worked. They took a booth in the back, and Margaret ordered 2 cups of coffee. Daniel drummed his fingers on the table. "Why are we here?" Margaret stirred her coffee slowly. "Because if they're following us, they'll want to know why." Daniel froze. "You're using us as bait?" Margaret smiled. "Smart boy." Daniel swallowed hard, resisting the urge to look over his shoulder. "And what happens if they take the bait?" Margaret took a slow sip of coffee. "Then we see what they do next." For the next hour, they sat, talking about nothing important, books, travel, the weather. But Daniel's body remained tense, his eyes scanning every reflection in the diner's windows. Then, just as they were finishing their coffee, he saw it. A man, standing by the gas station across the street. He wasn't pumping gas. He wasn't even pretending to. He was just watching. Daniel's pulse quickened. "Margaret." "I see him," she said calmly. "What do we do?" Margaret dropped some cash on the table and stood. "We leave." Daniel followed her out, his heart pounding. The man didn't move, but Daniel knew he was watching them go. As soon as they were back in the car, he turned to Margaret. "That proves it. They're here." Margaret nodded. "And now they know we know." Daniel exhaled sharply. "That doesn't exactly help us." Margaret smirked. "You're thinking like prey. Stop it." Daniel rubbed his temples. "Then how should I be thinking?" Margaret's expression hardened. "Like a survivor." That night, back at the house, they prepared. Margaret had pulled out an old trunk from her attic, filled with things her husband had left behind. Flashlights, emergency radios, a few legal documents that might come in handy. But most importantly, a firearm. Daniel stared at it. "I didn't take you for someone who kept a gun in the house." Margaret shrugged. "You live alone long enough, you learn to be careful." Daniel swallowed hard. "Do you think we'll need it?" Margaret met his gaze. "I hope not." But deep down, they both knew hope wasn't enough. The night stretched on in unbearable silence, the kind that pressed against the ears and made every small sound feel deafening. Margaret and Daniel sat in the dim light of the living room, neither speaking, neither truly resting. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, thick with anticipation. Margaret had her hands folded in her lap, her fingers tapping idly against her knee. Daniel, on the other hand, was wound tight, his jaw clenched as he stared out the window into the darkness beyond. He could feel it, something was coming. Then, the first sound. A soft scrape, barely audible, but enough to snap both of them to full alertness. Daniel's eyes flicked to Margaret, who had already shifted slightly in her seat, her gaze sharp and focused. Another sound, this time a low creak from the back door. They weren't imagining it. Daniel's heart pounded. He wasn't sure what terrified him more, the fact that they were coming or the eerie calm on Margaret's face. She motioned with her hand, a silent command for him to stay put. Slowly, she stood, moving with the kind of careful precision that suggested experience. She grabbed the small firearm she had pulled from the trunk earlier, her grip steady. A shadow flickered outside the window, just a brief movement, but enough to confirm what they already knew. Someone, or several someones, was out there. Daniel clenched his fists, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. He had spent so long running, so long being the hunted, that it felt unnatural to sit still. But Margaret had told him to wait, and for some reason, he trusted her instincts more than his own. The creak of the back door intensified as pressure was applied, someone testing the lock. Margaret took slow, measured steps toward the entryway, her finger poised near the trigger but not yet pressing down. Then, a low voice from outside, barely above a whisper. "You think you can hide him forever?" Daniel stiffened. The voice was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. Margaret didn't respond. She simply glanced back at Daniel, her expression unreadable, then turned her attention back to the door. There was no answer from inside the house, no reaction, just an unbearable stretch of silence. And then, bang! A loud, sharp pounding against the wood. Daniel jumped in his seat, his body instinctively shifting toward the door, but Margaret held up a hand, stopping him. He forced himself to stay put, though every muscle in his body screamed for action. Another bang, this time harder. Then, a second voice, colder. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Margaret let out a slow breath and, to Daniel's shock, moved toward the door. She didn't open it, not yet, but her voice, firm and unwavering, rang through the wood. "You're trespassing." A pause. The men outside hadn't expected that. Then, a laugh, dry and humorless. "Lady, you don't know what you're getting yourself into." Margaret's expression didn't change. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm getting into. The question is, do you?" Silence again. Then, without warning, the handle rattled violently. Daniel tensed, his body primed to react, but Margaret was already ahead of him. She lifted the gun, angled toward the door, and in a voice sharper than steel, she spoke one last time. "I have no problem pulling this trigger." The rattling stopped. The stillness that followed was suffocating, stretching on for what felt like eternity. Then, the first set of footsteps retreating. The second. The voices muttering in low, unreadable tones. And then, just like that, they were gone. Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Margaret, however, didn't move. She stood there for several seconds longer, as if waiting, making sure they were truly gone. Finally, she lowered the gun, her shoulders relaxing only slightly. Daniel pushed himself up from the couch, his legs unsteady. "Do you think they'll come back?" Margaret turned to face him, her gaze steady. "No. Not like this. They tried intimidation, and it didn't work. That means they'll change tactics." Daniel swallowed hard. "That's not exactly comforting." Margaret sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "No, it's not. But at least now we know where we stand." Daniel exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair. "So what now? We just sit here and wait for them to come at us another way?" Margaret shook her head. "No. We get ahead of them." Daniel frowned. "How?" She gave him a look. "You still have the files, don't you?" His stomach clenched. The files. The reason he was on the run in the first place. They were safely hidden, buried deep where no one would find them. But just having them wasn't enough. They needed to be used. Daniel hesitated. Yeah. I have them. Margaret nodded, already forming a plan. Then it's time we make sure they see the light of day. Daniel felt a surge of something, fear, adrenaline, maybe even hope. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just running. He was fighting back. And this time, he wasn't doing it alone. Margaret and Daniel sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the tension between them thick as they laid out their next move. The old wooden table between them was covered in documents, hastily scribbled notes, and a single laptop glowing softly in the darkness. Daniel's hands hovered over the keyboard, his fingers twitching with nervous energy. Margaret, on the other hand, remained as steady as ever. She leaned back in her chair, her sharp eyes scanning the scattered papers. "We can't sit on this any longer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "They backed off last night, but that doesn't mean they won't try again. And next time, they'll be smarter." Daniel nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I need to be sure. Once we put this out there, there's no going back." Margaret gave him a long, measured look. "There was no going back the moment you found out the truth." Daniel clenched his jaw, looking down at the screen. The files were all there, encrypted, hidden behind layers of security. But security wouldn't matter anymore, not once the world knew. With a deep breath, he typed in the final command, and the files began to upload. For a moment, neither of them spoke, watching the progress bar inch forward. Every second felt like an eternity, but finally, the upload completed with a quiet ping. Daniel's heart pounded as he set up the automatic distribution, multiple sources, news outlets, online forums, even anonymous leaks to the authorities. Within minutes, the information would be out in the world, impossible to bury. Margaret exhaled slowly. "It's done." Daniel nodded, but the weight on his chest didn't lift. If anything, it grew heavier. He pushed away from the table, standing abruptly and pacing the small kitchen. "Do you think this will be enough?" Margaret watched him, her expression unreadable. "It has to be." Daniel let out a humorless laugh. "That's not exactly reassuring." She stood, crossing her arms as she leaned against the counter. "Look, I know you're scared. But you did the right thing. The only thing. And now, it's up to the rest of the world to decide what to do with it." Daniel nodded, but the uneasy feeling in his gut didn't go away. He knew the kind of people they were up against, powerful, ruthless. And desperate people did desperate things. As if reading his mind, Margaret reached out and squeezed his shoulder. "We're not alone in this." The word settled something deep inside him. And then the phone rang. Both of them tensed instantly, their eyes snapping to the burner phone resting on the table. It was an unknown number. No one had this number except for the people who mattered. Daniel hesitated before picking it up. "Hello?" There was silence on the other end. Then a voice, low and rough. "You just made a very big mistake." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened, but he forced his voice to stay steady. "The mistake was yours. Thinking you could keep this buried forever." A pause. Then, a slow chuckle. "You think this is over? You think exposing the truth changes anything?" Daniel's stomach twisted, but he held firm. "It changes everything." The chuckle stopped. A beat of silence stretched out before the voice spoke again, colder this time. "You won't be able to run forever." Daniel swallowed hard, but before he could respond, the line went dead. Margaret was already moving. "We need to go." Daniel looked at her, his mind racing. "Go where?" "We don't even know." She cut him off. "We can't stay here. They'll come for us. And fast." She was right. They had exposed everything, but that didn't mean they were safe. If anything, they had just painted a giant target on their backs. They grabbed what little they could carry, documents, cash, the laptop, before slipping out into the night. The air was thick with tension as they moved quickly, avoiding main roads, sticking to shadows. Daniel's mind raced. Had they done enough? Had the truth reached the right people? Or had they just signed their own death warrants? Margaret walked beside him, her step steady, her gaze focused. She wasn't afraid. Or if she was, she didn't show it. As they disappeared into the darkness, one thought lingered in Daniel's mind. The truth was out. Now, they just had to survive long enough to see what happened next.